hung upside down in a barn for stealing an apple. A cowboy cut the rope and gave her a loaded orchard. The rope was tied to the crossbeam with a drover's hitch. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Her ankles were bound tight, both of them, and she was hanging maybe 4 feet off the ground, arms dangling, face gone the color of a beet, hair straight down. The lantern was still burning in the corner, which told me they hadn't been gone long. I stood there a moment longer than I probably should have. There was a half-eaten apple on the straw near the door, just sitting there. Not much of a bite taken out of it, like she'd barely gotten started before they caught her. I took my knife from my belt and cut her down. She didn't thank me, didn't scream, didn't cry. She hit the ground on her hands and caught herself, rolled once, and came up with her fists raised, eyes wild, hair across her face. Like she was going to fight me too. I stepped back and held the knife out to the side so she could see it wasn't aimed at her. She looked at the knife, looked at me, looked at the open door of the barn. I said the apple was from my tree. She said nothing. I said, "You're welcome to it." That was the beginning of it, or close enough to the beginning that I'll call it that. My name is Caleb Durst. I was 53 years old that autumn, which doesn't sound like much until you've lived 53 years in the high scrub country east of the Cascades. The land takes a piece of you every season, not dramatically. Just a slow leaching, the way frost gets into a post and ruins it from the inside, and one day you lean on it and it goes. I had 400 acres. Dryland wheat in the lower fields, hay in 2 of the meadows, and the orchard on the south slope, 40 trees, mostly apples, some pear, a row of cherry I'd put in my last year with Margaret, who died of a fever before the cherries ever bore fruit. That was 11 years gone. The orchard was the thing I was proudest of and least able to explain. A man doesn't grow fruit trees in eastern Oregon for profit. He grows them because something in him still believes in the summer. Because tending a thing that gives sweet fruit is a kind of argument against everything the land tells you about itself. I had a hired man, Horace Beam, who'd worked for me 7 years. He'd been the one to string her up. He told me about it the next morning, proud as anything, caught a thief in the orchard, he said. He'd tied her so she'd think twice before she came back. I told him to take his bedroll and his week's wages and go. He looked at me like I'd lost my senses. Maybe I had. She was still on my property when I found Horace's camp in the creek draw, a bedroll, a canvas pack, a tin cup. She'd been living rough for some time. The pack had a spare dress in it, a Bible with the front pages torn out, a tin of lard, and a handful of dried corn. That was everything she owned. I carried the pack up to the house. She was sitting on the porch step when I got back, not like she'd come asking for anything, more like she'd decided to be somewhere and had picked my step as the spot. She was younger than I'd thought in the barn, maybe 30, maybe a few years either side. Cheekbones sharp from not eating enough, hands rough. Polish maybe, or Czech, something in the set of her jaw and the width of her face that wasn't born on this side of the water. I set the pack down in front of her. She looked at it. She said, "You fired him." Yes. Because of me. Because he made a judgment that wasn't his to make. She was quiet a while. The wind came through the ponderosas west of the house, that dry sound like paper. She said, "I wasn't going to steal more than the one. I was hungry." I know. I would have knocked at the door, but there was a man with a rifle out by the barn. That was Horace. He took his rifle with him. She looked out across the yard toward the orchard, which you could see from the porch if the light was right. The rows of trees on the slope, still holding their late apples, the grass gone tawny between them. She said her name was Vera. Just the one name, offered like she wasn't sure she trusted me with more. I told her she could sleep in the small room off the kitchen, which had been the hired girl's room when Margaret was alive, and which had sat empty since. I told her there was work if she wanted it, and she could eat at the table, and I wouldn't hold the apple against her. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. In the morning, she was in the kitchen when I came down, had already made coffee, and was standing at the window looking east to where the light was starting to come in over the rimrock. She worked like she was proving something. I don't know what, and I never asked. The orchard that fall needed picking finished, and she picked. She was faster than Horace had been and more careful. She didn't bruise the fruit, set each apple in the crate like it mattered, which to me it did. She figured out on her own how to grade them, watching me do the first crate, then just doing it herself without comment. In the afternoons, she cooked. She made things I hadn't had in years. a soup she did with dried beans, and something she pulled from the kitchen garden I'd let go mostly to weeds, flavored with a handful of dried herbs from a packet in her pack. She repaired 2 of the cane chairs that had needed it since spring. She found the broken hinge on the cold cellar door and asked me if I had a spare hinge, which I did, and fixed it herself. I watched all of this without saying much about it. A man learns, after enough years alone, not to remark on things too quickly. Remarking too fast runs a thing off. But I noticed the way she moved, which was efficient without being hurried. I noticed that she didn't chatter at me the way some women do when they're nervous, which I appreciated. I noticed that she had her own counsel and kept it. I noticed that she'd put a fresh candle in the tin holder on the kitchen windowsill, and I hadn't had a candle there in 11 years. There was a man in town named Garfield Potts who held the note on my lower 40. I'd borrowed against it 4 years back when the wheat got rust blight and I lost most of the crop. I'd paid steadily since, and I had 2 seasons left on the note, but Potts was not a man who wanted the money back. Potts was a man who wanted the land. He came out in early November with his 2 sons, who were built like fence posts and about as bright. He tied his horses at the rail and came up on the porch and stood there with his hat on, which told you everything about the kind of man he was. Vera was in the orchard. I could see her from the porch, moving between the trees with a pruning hook. Potts said he wanted to talk about the note. I told him we could talk here on the porch. He said he'd prefer to come inside, and I said I'd prefer he didn't. One of the sons shifted his weight, and I looked at him until he stopped. Potts said he'd heard I'd taken in a woman. He said the way he'd heard it was uncharitable. He said a man my age, alone out here, taking in a vagrant, there were people in town with concerns. He said it with that careful venom men like him use when they want to make something dirty that isn't. I said, she works here, that's the end of it. He said the note had a clause. Did I know about the clause? That gave him certain rights if the property was used in ways contrary to public decency. I said, Garfield, if you try to use that clause on a woman picking my apples, I will have that note in front of a judge in Prineville before the week is out, and you'll spend the next year explaining yourself to people who don't like you either. He looked at me. I looked at him. He put his hat back straight, which he'd tipped to the side the way some men do when they're trying to look reasonable, and he went down the steps and got on his horse, and his sons followed him out the gate. I stood there a while after. The wind had picked up, and it was cold, proper November cold, and the trees in the orchard were bare now except for the highest branches where a few last apples hung. Vera had stopped working, and she was standing partway up the slope, watching. She'd seen the whole thing. She didn't ask about it that night. We ate supper. She'd made a venison hash with the last of the root vegetables, and I didn't bring it up, and neither did she. But it was there between us the way things are when 2 people have witnessed the same thing, and each knows the other knows. After supper, she poured coffee and sat down across from me, which she'd started doing about 2 weeks in, when she stopped taking her coffee to the other room. She said, he'll come back. Probably. Are you going to sell? No. She looked at her coffee. She said, where I came from, the man who owned the land always won eventually. I said, where was that? She was quiet a moment. Then she said, outside Krakow. My father had 60 acres, good ground. The men who wanted it kept finding reasons. She paused. He held on a long time, longer than most thought he could. I didn't ask what happened at the end. I could tell from the way she said it. I said, this is different ground. She looked up at me. Something moved in her face, not exactly a smile, more like a door opening an inch. She said, yes, it is. The winter came hard that year. Hard and early, snow by the 20th of November, which isn't unusual, but that year it stayed. I'd laid in good supplies and the animals were set, but the weeks turned long and closed the way they do when the world goes white, and there's nothing to do but keep the fires and wait. We were together in that house through all of it. I want to be careful how I say this because it's easy to make it into something soft, and I'd rather not. What happened between Vera and me that winter wasn't soft? It was 2 people learning the shape of each other over months of cold and lamplight, and honest work and conversation that didn't start easy but got there. She told me about Poland in pieces. Not a story but fragments, the way real memory comes. Her mother's kitchen, a certain road in winter, a brother who went to Warsaw and was not heard from again, the crossing to Hamburg and then the ship, and then the long train across a country that was so much bigger than she'd been told, and getting off in a town she'd chosen because it had a name she could pronounce, and that town failing her, and then another, and then the walking, and then my apple tree. I told her about Margaret. I hadn't talked about Margaret in years, not because I was protecting the grief, but because there hadn't been anyone worth spending it on. I told Vera about how we'd built this place from a half-built shack and 2 horses, about the cherry trees Margaret wanted, about the fever that came in June and was gone by July and took her with it. I told her about the 11 years after, which I said in fewer words because they deserved fewer. She listened the way some people do, without filling up the silence, letting it sit until I was ready for the next part. One night in January, late, the fire down to coals, she said to me, "You have been very alone." Not as pity, not even as observation exactly, more like she was saying, "I see it. I know what this place has cost you. I am saying it out loud so you know I know." I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "Yes." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Just that, left it there a moment, and then picked up her coffee cup. I didn't sleep well that night, not from anything bad, just from the strangeness of being known. March came, and with it mud and the first real thaw, and then the news out of Prineville that Garfield Potts had been found to have doctored 3 sets of land records, and the county was looking at him hard. I heard it from the feed merchant, who told it like a story he'd been saving. Apparently Potts had done the same thing to a family in the Ochoko foothills, and that family had finally lawyered up. I paid off the remainder of the note in April, 2 seasons early. I had the money because the orchard had sold better than any year I could remember. Vera's graded fruit, packed clean, came out at a premium at the Bend market, and I'd sold every crate. I walked to the county office and paid in cash, and came home with the clear title in my shirt pocket. Vera was in the orchard. She'd been out since breakfast pruning the young trees I'd put in the fall before she came, training the leaders the right way. She knew what she was doing with trees, which had surprised me at first and then didn't. She'd grown up on 60 acres, and she paid attention. I walked up the slope to where she was. She looked at me and saw something in my face and stopped work. I took the title out of my pocket and held it up. She read it. Her English was good by then, better than she let on, and her face changed. She said, "Clear." "Clear." She took the paper and looked at it a moment, then handed it back. She said, "Your father built this." "I built it. My father died when I was 12. She looked out at the orchard, all the rows, the trees she knew by now, the new grafts she'd done in February wrapped in cloth against the cold. She said, 40 trees. 42 now. I put in 2 more. She smiled at that. A real one, which I'd learned to distinguish from the polite ones she gave when she was being patient with me. She said, "This is a good place." I said, "It is." And then I said what I'd been working up to for about 3 months, which wasn't much as speeches go, but I'm not a man who does speeches. I told her she could have the east quarter of the orchard in her own name if she wanted it. The 20 trees on the lower slope that got the most sun. I'd been to see the lawyer in Bend about it, and it was possible. A deed in her name, no conditions. She looked at me. I said, "You've earned it 3 times over, and you know those trees better than I do now." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the branches, which still had their early buds just beginning. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because this ground is yours as much as it is mine. Because you've worked it, and you know it, and you love it, and I can see that you love it, and a person ought to own the ground they love." She turned away from me and looked down the slope at the lower trees. I waited. When she turned back, her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set the way it always was. That particular set that meant she was deciding something. She said, "I don't want the east quarter." I started to say something, and she stopped me. She said, "I want to stay on all of it, not as a worker, not as a tenant." She paused. "If that is something you are asking." I said, "It is something I am asking." She nodded once, like we'd settled a business arrangement, which maybe we had. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around me, which she'd never done before, and I put mine around her. And she was smaller than she looked when she was working, and she smelled like sawdust and cold air and the cut green of the pruned branches. We stood there on the slope for a while between the rows. We married in June. The preacher came out from town, and we did it in the orchard, which felt right. Horace Beam showed up uninvited, and I let him stay because it seemed ungenerous not to, and afterward he shook my hand and said he'd been wrong about her, which was about as much as I expected from Horace. The cherry trees bloomed that spring for the first time, the ones I'd planted with Margaret, 11 years late, or right on time depending on how you looked at it. The fruit came in July, small and dark and sweet, and Vera put some up in jars, and we ate the rest straight off the tree over the course of a week, standing in the row in the morning light, and I cannot tell you much about joy except that it has a temperature and it was warm. She ran the orchard, that's the plain truth of it. I managed the wheat and the hay and the animals and the business end of things, and Vera ran the orchard, and in 3 years we had 60 trees and were selling to markets in Bend and Portland, and once to a hotel in San Francisco that wanted the pears, which were exceptional, which was her doing. The people in town who had listened to Garfield Potts, there weren't many of them, but there were some, stopped crossing the street when they saw us. A woman doesn't make 40 trees produce like that, and not earn a kind of respect that shuts mouths. And I was the man who'd stood on that porch and sent Potts and his sons away without backing up an inch, which people remembered. I'm not going to tell you it was all light. There were hard years, a frost that took half the crop one spring, a summer the creek ran low and we lost 3 trees, a winter I got sick and Vera nursed me through 6 weeks of it with a patience that I didn't deserve and that I haven't forgotten. There were arguments, a few of them real ones, the kind that leave you quiet for 2 days and then find their way through. That's land, that's people, that's a life. But here is what I want to say, and I want to say it plain. I was a man who had been alone for a long time. Not bitter, not broken, but worn down in the way of things left too long in weather. The orchard was the one place I put whatever I still had of hope, because it kept producing sweet things regardless of what the years took. That is what an orchard is if you tend it right. And then a woman dropped out of my barn rafters with her fists raised, half-starved, not asking for a single thing except not to be touched. And she turned out to be the person who saw what this place was and what I was, and she chose it. Chose me. Not because she had nowhere else to go, I know the difference. She had her own will and her own pride and her own acre of stubbornness that I got to know very well over the years, and she chose this. She chose me. A man doesn't take that lightly, or anyway he shouldn't. I am 61 years old now. The orchard has 68 trees. There is a girl of 7 who helps her mother pick and can name every variety by the shape of the apple, which impresses me every time. Some mornings I come downstairs and Vera is already in the kitchen the way she was that first morning, coffee made, standing at the window watching the light come in over the rimrock. Only now she turns when she hears my step, and the look on her face is the thing I have tried many times to find a word for and have not. It is not soft. It is not sentimental. It is the look of a woman who has made a decision and is satisfied with it every morning she wakes up to it. That is enough. That is more than enough. The candle is still in the tin holder on the windowsill. She replaces it when it burns down. I've never asked her to, and she's never said why, and I've never needed to know. Outside, the trees are full of green fruit, still weeks from ripe, and the light this time of morning is long and gold across the slope. And this is the ground we own, the 2 of us, clear title, and it is ours.